Hello, this is lecture 2 from topic 8, and in this we are going to be taking a look at prostitution policy. Your textbook looks at 4 models of prostitution policy: prohibition, criminalization, abolition, legalization, regulation, and decriminalization. Let's take a look at each of these. Now, as we've seen with other issues we've been studying this semester, it's really not until the start of the 20th century that we see this policy enter into the public policy domain. And that is the case with prostitution as well. So, the first model we're looking at is prohibition criminalization. And from colonial times to the end of the 19th century, prostitution was not a distinct criminal offense. And this changes at the end of the 19th century. Prior to that, prostitution and prostitutes and brothel owners were really allowed to engage in that endeavor, and that the criminal justice system would only get involved when it came to like vagrancy or disorderly conduct, but the selling of sex itself was not criminalized. But that changes at the end of the 19th century. And that corresponds with the rise of sort of social puritanism, right? That we saw embraced by Anthony Comstock and others. And so there's this idea of the woman as sort of the virtuous woman versus the fallen woman. And so good women are virtuous, right? That they are chaste, they only engage in sexual activities once they're married, and so that virtue being a virtuous person as a woman is really wrapped up in one's understanding of that woman's sexuality. Bad women are the ones who fall out of virtue, right? They're the ones who are, having sex outside of wedlock. They're the ones who might engage in prostitution. And so we've got this good versus bad in terms of women and sexuality. And so when we think about prostitution policy and the prohibition criminalization of prostitution, the focus is really on women, right? Women are the problem, because they are women who are engaging in prostitution are deviant, right? And they needed to be treated as serious criminals. But when it comes to men, they're sort of outside of the prohibition criminalization calculus. Men seeking sex is natural, whether they seek it outside of wedlock or whether they seek it within marriage or with a prostitute. So the rise of the concern about prostitution didn't have to do with men, but it had to do with at that time the society's understanding of what it means to be a good or a fallen woman. So within the Model 1, that prostitution is treated as a serious crime. It's viewed as harmful, and therefore it should be treated as such. And so your textbook talks about some of the major policy movements that sort of are examples of the treating prostitution as an endeavor that should be criminalized. They talk about the Mann Act of 1910 that prohibits the trafficking of women. And so it focuses on bringing women into the United States, sort of in terms of sexual trafficking, and then moving them throughout the United States in order to satisfy sexual needs, and to profit off of that sex trafficking. And so the Mann Act in 1910 is one of these national laws. It's a federal law that really cracks down on prostitution. The Chamberlain-Conn Act of 1918 focuses on prostitution as it relates to war, that it gives the government the power to arrest, test, and detain any woman who's within 5 miles of a military camp. It's sort of seen as, hey, you've got a military camp, that there's going to be women who are going to be selling their sex in order to satisfy the men who are on the military base. And so it's viewed as sort of a public health program, but with targeting women, not necessarily targeting men. And your textbook also talks about the standardized repression laws. These are model laws, and we'll see this again. These kinds of policies are left to the state unless it has to do with the military, right? Or unless it has to do with transporting of women between state lines. But when it came to criminalization of prostitution at the state level, that is left to each state. But there were model laws that were created in an effort to get states to sort of adopt a uniform approach to prostitution. And so it's a model law that offers general criminalization of prostitution. And it was adopted by every state in the United States by 1925, except for one, which remains today, which is Nevada. And so this is the model that's still enforced in the United States, prohibiting prostitution and viewing prostitution as a crime, just like any crime that we would have national criminal code and state criminal statutes. So prohibition, criminalization, it remains the standard in the United States. There are several criticisms of the prohibition criminalization model. One criticism is the laws are sexist, that they see the woman as the cause of the problem, and therefore the woman is the one who gets the brunt of the criminal penalty. The crimes target women who are the sellers of sex. The crimes tend not to purchase or focus on the purchaser of sex, the man. And so with this criticism of prohibition criminalization, the solution has been not to decriminalize prostitution, but rather to demand gender neutral language in criminal law dealing with prostitution, and also increase the penalties and focus more penalties on those who are purchasing sex. Another criticism of the prohibition criminalization model is that the laws are enforced in a racially biased manner. So the vast majority of prostitution, it doesn't take place on the streets, okay? People place ads in magazines, on the internet, and the prostitution takes place behind closed doors. And what takes place behind closed doors out of the public arena is much more difficult for the police to target and to address and to arrest people involved in it. Not that it's impossible, but it's just more difficult. But for those that are prostitutes on the street, those are the ones that are targeted by the police. And those who are on the streets as prostitutes are disproportionately women of color. And so that because there's this emphasis on targeting prostitution in the public arena on the streets rather than in the private areas, that the criminalization laws disproportionately impact women of color. And then finally, there's a sense that the laws invade privacy, that prostitution should be treated not as a crime, but as an act between two consenting adults. And so this would really be a movement towards decriminalizing prostitution rather than just reforming criminal law. And so their approach is that this criminalizes a private consensual act of adults, and that is really not the purview of criminal law. The second model that your textbook talks about is the abolition of prostitution. And so this would be like getting rid of prostitution, not criminalizing it, not regulating it, not decriminalizing it, but ending prostitution. And this is an early feminist response to criminalization. And it's a reflection of the social purity movement, but from a very first wave feminist perspective. So the social purity movement can result in saying that you have virtuous women and you have fallen women, and we should punish fallen women. But another approach, and a more of a feminist approach to this, that comes from the social purity movement, is the idea that women are victims of prostitution. And so the first wave feminists saw that prostitution was a form of oppression, that women were victims to men who were trapping them into sex bondage, right? That they, for whatever reason, men were preying on women who were maybe poor or women who were seemed to be like categorized as non-virtuous, and then preying upon them and getting them into the sex trafficking trade. And so for the first wave feminists, that we need that they wanted to end that oppression. They wanted to protect women from that victimization. And so the first wave feminists wanted to abolish prostitution. The way to do that was not to punish the women, but to punish those who were purveying prostitutes, so brothels and sex traffickers, and also punishing those who were victimizing women, those who were purchasing sex. So for them, that women needed protection. They needed protective laws, and so you heavily focus on punishing those who are profiting off of the prostitution, and then women who are prostitutes, that you would not put them in jail, but that you would rehabilitate them, you would treat them, and hopefully get them on the path to becoming less fallen women and more virtuous. And you'll see that this is reflected in some of the early policies in 19th century law, early 19th century law. And so that early 19th into the 20th century, before the criminalization sort of takes over. The third model that your textbook talks about is legalization regulation. So the thinking here is that prostitution is inevitable, that men have sexual desires that need to be met. But the prostitution, while it's inevitable, it's harmful. And so the legalization regulation approach is harm reduction. And so that prostitution can be harmful to the health of both the woman and the male because of sexually transmitted disease. That if you have a brothel in your neighborhood that's unregulated, that it can have impact on the property values, and it can also bring about disorder within the community. And so the thinking here is that make this a legal endeavor, prostitution, but have the government really involved in regulating it. Okay, and so the approach in this model is to regulate harm. That you're going to have, if you're going to have prostitutes, make sure that they are getting frequent health checkups so that they are not having sexually transmitted diseases and therefore not transmitting them. Make sure that there are, that the people who are running the brothels know that they're being regulated by the government. Checkups from the health department, checkup from social services, making sure that women are not being abused and treated appropriately. And so, these are the kinds, this is the kind of approach that's been taken in the one state where prostitution is legal in the United States, Nevada. It's also the Amsterdam approach as well, that it is legal, but it's heavily regulated by the state. And that this kind of model gets very little support from feminists. And maybe ask yourself why. The reason it doesn't get a lot of support from feminists is because it is just the heavy hand of the state really regulating a woman's body, right? It's almost that a woman's body becomes sort of the property of the state when she becomes a prostitute. She doesn't set the rates of what she's going to get paid. The state would set that. She would be subject to intrusive health inspections because the state is monitoring that. And even the conditions of the brothel would be set by the state. So there's very little feminist support for the legalization regulation approach. The final model for prostitution policy is decriminalization. And I know several of you are writing your public policy papers on this, so I look forward to what you are coming up with in terms of different policies approach. Decriminalization is basically saying that prostitution is not a crime, prostitution is work, and it should be treated like all other forms of work. That prostitution is sex work, and as such, it should be treated like any other form of work. That the harm of prostitution comes from its prohibition, right? It comes from the criminalization and all the dangers that come with the criminalization of an activity, because we know that the activity is going to continue, but because it's criminalized, then you're going to have, it goes underground. It becomes much less safe for women. That women are harmed in the process of engaging in prostitution because it's a crime. They're not likely to report it because they don't want to get in further trouble, making it a very precarious and dangerous endeavor for women to engage in. And so, the idea is decriminalizing it, treating it like any other form of work, where there would be, the women and men who engage in sex work would set their fee rate, that they would, view it as a contract that they're making with others. There might be some minor regulations from the state, like you might have with a massage parlor or those sorts of things, but mostly it would be seen as and treated like any other form of work. And this is the contemporary policy debate that's going on, and we're going to have a whole discussion about this next week on this issue. And it seems like that from the article you're going to be reading that it is gaining some traction, the decriminalization model. It does have support from third wave feminists and current sex workers, and it's also sort of feeding into this, notion that is sort of maybe challenging the radical feminists who would be against, would want to abolish prostitution, because that's seen as sort of an old tired ethics in terms of understanding sex. All right, that's just a quick overview of the different models. There's much more in the textbook, and for those who are writing policy papers on this, I'm looking forward to reading them.